right, we are live. Well, welcome to another episode of the Reintroduction Podcast. This is episode 14. Very, very excited to be with you this evening. I have him here with my co-host, Mina Sawiris, and we have a very, very special guest all the way from Australia. We have Dr. Sam Kaldas with us. And for those of you who don't know Sam Kaldas is from Sydney, Australia, but he is a lecturer and a professor at St. Cyril's all the way in Australia. He did his PhD in philosophy, and his PhD in particular included questions about religious knowledge, the existence of God, the problem of evil. These are all topics that many of us have had conversations and grappled about, whether it be at coffee shops, whether it be, in church, small groups, etc. So we're really excited to have Sam on this discussion this evening, because the topic today is about why God doesn't make himself abundantly clear to the world. So is he playing hard to get? And this is a misconception that a lot of people have about God, that he's trying to hide himself from people so that there is battles and wars. So Sam, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
No, thanks so much, Chris, for having me. It was a long flight from Sydney, but I'm almost recovered now. It's really good to be here. No, thanks, Chris. We were talking before. I really love the podcast. I think it's great. It's a real honor to be with you today.
Thank you, Sam. We're really excited to have you. And we're really sorry for all the technical difficulties. We're about 10 minutes late, but Facebook keeps on changing on us and we can't keep up. So
the amount of trouble I've had with Zoom lately for working things, I've completely, that was nothing.
We have a lot of people that are zoomed out, so we're excited and we're thankful for all those who are tuning in and watching, to this discussion. So, Sam, this is a conversation that a lot of people really struggle with, about how come God doesn't make himself abundantly clear to us. There are a variety of religions, there are a lot of people who battle about God, and how come God doesn't just appear out of nowhere, so that the whole world we can end this debate from now, so give us your thoughts, kind of,
And before you jump in, Sam, it's kind of also, it's one of those things that Christians, non-Christians, and people who don't believe in God all can kind of find some common ground on. People usually say, like if you're non-Christian, or if you don't believe in God, you're atheist, you say God needs to make himself a little bit more clear. We see the case with Bertrand Russell, known atheist, and he said, when someone asked him, what are you going to do if you die and you find God? And he said, if I find God, I'm going to ask him, how come he did not make his presence more sufficient? And for Christians, some of us want it to strengthen our faith. And we say, you know what, I need to see God just so God can appear and do this and do that for me. And it's kind of what we all agree on. So everyone is asking that question. Why is it that God does not make himself so obvious to everybody? Is he really playing hard to get? Is this whole thing about faith is getting a little bit too difficult? Like blind faith, this concept is to just believe without knowing. Is that what we're talking about here? Is God playing hard to get, or what's going on?
That's a really good point about Bertrand Russell. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, in that you're right. This is something that unusually, like, believers and non-believers can both agree on. Like, everybody would like, if God is out there, if he could be a little bit more obvious about it. So, I mean, I don't know. So maybe to kick off the discussion, let me just take a step back for a moment, because I think that it's going to be important to distinguish just a sort of like a framework within which we can have this discussion. Because so you guys had Manny on last week, and he made a really eloquent. It's the part that you picked out as a video, right, where he's talking about how difficult it is to talk about what God is and who God is, because of the nature of his mysterious, incomprehensible nature. So that's really important here, because a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of these questions are questions about God's motives and his methods. Why he does what he does, and how he goes about like bringing about the goals that he has. And so I think it's important to sort of like discuss or make explicit at the beginning how it is that we can even say anything about that. And so like the short answer is that we can only, like as Christians, our source for being able to say things definitively and confidently about God is only what he has revealed to us through Scripture, through Christ, through the church. And wherever those sources of like God's self-revelation don't give a clear answer, doesn't mean there's nothing that we can say. We can still think, and there's still hints here and there, but we also have to be a lot more like humble about the certainty with which we say things. So I think, yeah, I just that's an important thing to be clear. Like, if God doesn't give an answer to particular questions, we just have to be aware about what we can know for sure and what is a bit of a mystery. So to bring that back to this question, right? I think that so like your first suggested question was like, are we even sure that God wants us to know him? Like, is that something that, you know, because maybe he's there and he's not that keen for everyone to know about him. But the reason this is a problem is because in Scripture, the God that we have in the Bible, he very clearly he does want everybody to know him, right? He's always talking about, Jesus is always talking about how he wants people to know the Father. That's the purpose he that brought him to the earth in the first place. You know, God desires all men to be saved, come to the knowledge of the truth, that sort of thing. But I think what maybe like a first point, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is that if we're just going from the Bible, right, and the picture of God we get there, God does want everyone to know him, but it's not a given. It's a sort of project that God is working on. So I'm thinking particularly of like in the Old Testament, one of the descriptions of the final like paradise, or like the new heaven and the new earth that God is going to bring about once all the evil has been defeated and everything's been accomplished, is that the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Right? That's a phrase that occurs in like Isaiah and Hosea, recurs a few times. But that's happening at the same time that, you know, this is when the lion is lying down with the lamb, and, you know, all the there's peace in the whole world and everything, and then all the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. But before then, there's an obstacle to that, which is well, in the Old Testament specifically, it's always human sin and evil, right? There's injustice, there's oppression, and there's mistreatment of the poor, and there's the breaking of the commandments. And that's why in those passages, God's saying, until this is fixed, there won't be knowledge of me in all the earth. People won't know me. So I think that's an important thing, right? It's something that God does want, according to the Bible, but it's something that he's almost not expecting to be fully realized until the end. It's an eschatological project. I don't know. What do you guys think?
It's a question that, like you said, it is difficult to comprehend in its entirety, because also God, as faithful as he is, he has to be able to show himself to different people, and people will be giving different answers. So if that same question is being asked to a theologian, being asked to a scientist, and being asked to someone who knows nothing about science or theology, they each should be able to speak to that from their own experience. A theologian will cite scriptural passages. A scientist will look at, like, you know, the physics of the universe or the human cell or something, and say, you know what, no, God has revealed himself here. Someone who hasn't experienced these things should have an experience. If God is just, that person should have some sort of experience as well to corroborate what God wants him to know. And I think that takes us to exactly what you said, in the sense that the question then that's formulated is, why would God, if God does exist, assuming that he does, why would God want to reveal himself to us in the first place? And maybe that will kind of dictate the next steps. Is the intention of him showing himself is to prove to us his existence, or could it be a different reason? Because if it is to prove his existence, then I see Bertrand Russell's point. Like, he does show himself, and it is obvious in some ways, but it's not the fullness. You don't see the fullness of God sometimes in a blatant, in your face kind of way. And maybe he has a point, but that was if God's point is for us to actually know that he exists.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it is his goal. Like, the Bible's fairly clear about that, but it's an end goal. So there are other steps before that. Other things have to be achieved before that, and yeah, we'll probably get more into that as we go. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question that a lot of people ask, because obviously it depends from what worldview you come from, right? So if you come from a Christian perspective, you believe that God has made himself apparent to humanity. You know, Christ came, dwelt amongst man, you know, revealed himself to man. But even when he made himself abundantly clear to people, people still didn't believe in him. So it's like this really interesting dialogue for those who don't believe in Christ, that have, you know, come from a different worldview, different faith system. You know, I think that question becomes much more difficult to grapple, because if, you do believe in a different religion, it's something that you do have to figure out, like, yeah, if I believe in a different faith, and I want to disprove all the other people that do believe in this Jesus character, or this, Vishnu, or whatever other faith system that people believe in, it just becomes much more challenging. The only faith system that I think God dwells among man is Christianity. So I think for me that question is challenging. But the question for me is not, why doesn't God make himself clear, but how come he doesn't it's the personal question. How come he doesn't make himself clear to me? How come he hasn't made himself abundantly clear to people around me? So not the public problem, so to speak, like you've described it, Sam, but more of the personal problem. But let's tap into the public problem first a little bit, God's hiddenness from the world, so to speak. So Mina, why don't you jump in and tell us what you think about the public problem? Why is God hidden from the world?
Well, I think the first point goes to that first question is, why would God reveal himself to people? And if it is not just for the knowledge, if God is not just so blatantly in your face, then maybe he's not just seeking that he exists. Maybe he wants you to just take that for granted for a second. Maybe if he is someone who's seeking a personal relationship, if the God that you believe in is seeking a personal relationship, then he might choose to reveal himself in a different way. And that's something that we see in the Christian faith that is really highlighted in many things. And if God wants to reveal himself to us in order for us to have a relationship, not in order for us to believe that he exists, then we have to look at a couple of different things. How would he do it then? If God does exist and he wants us to know, how would he do it? Would it just be would he just all of a sudden draw the curtain and you can see God the Father for who he is? But would we be able to kind of handle that? Probably not, because God is, immaterial. We can't see God the Father. He would have to choose a different way. Maybe he can just uproot Burj Khalifa from Dubai, move it all the way to New York, and then we see cosmic wonders everywhere. Would that be a sign that would get people to believe? Maybe people in New York would believe and people in Dubai, but what about South Africa? Okay, maybe he can move the pyramids to South Africa, but then he would have to do that for every group of people in order for them to see a miracle. And even at the end of it, people are just fickle. They tend to get over things very quickly, and they can find explanations and say, you know what? No, there's a reason. There's a scientific reason why this phenomenon is happening. Maybe it's not God. So
the water was corrupted in that city and people were hallucinating or something.
Right. Exactly. There's always a reason. And that now in the 21st century is that we can all watch the same exact thing and have completely two different, experiences with it. I mean, take that about football or soccer, and just watch something and say, you know what, this is a foul, this is a penalty, and no, it's not, if it's your team or it's not, or even politics. So there's so many reasons we just don't agree. Welcome to the 21st century. That's just how we do things today. So even when it comes to that, we can't really, sorry, Sam.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say the past too. Yeah, not just today. No, sorry.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, so it's even in today's world, God making himself publicly known to us will have to come in a different way, because even if we agree on all these things, maybe then that's not the answer. It's not the public way then, because the public way shows knowledge of God, because God would only use it to display his power. And display of power, we might get into that later, display of power really will get us to maybe be obedient and to acknowledge that he does exist. But it will not do any more than that. If you're seeking a relationship or you're seeking love, that is not going to come from just this ginormous revelation. Same way.
100%. I completely. I think that's really the core of it, because the reason we have the concern in this problem is that God could do so much. It's so much. If God really wants people to know him, it's not like it takes energy or effort for God to transport the Burj Khalifa from city to city. He could do all those things. And so like I said, we're sort of we can't speak definitively about why God does the way he does, or why he does it or doesn't do it the way that he's chosen to. But I think you're right, because even in the Gospels where Jesus comes, so I mean, in Jesus, right, he kind of is doing exactly what we're saying we wish he would do. He's taken a physical form that you can see and talk to and hear, and he's walking around doing miracles. But all the Gospels tell lots of stories. Some of them I find kind of like funny in an ironic way, where he'll do a miracle and like immediately the people are divided in their reaction, right? So like, for example, when he heals people on the Sabbath, the Pharisees instantly like, oh my God, he healed on the
Right.
Sabbath. We've got to kill him. Who's this guy think he is? Well, the one that I find even more like slightly funny, I feel a bit guilty for funny is, but like in the chapter right after, so in John 11, Jesus raises Lazarus. And then there's a little verse in chapter 12 where the Pharisees are like, we've got to kill Lazarus. I mean,
Yeah.
it's we can't let this continue, because now he's, everyone's believing in Jesus because of Lazarus. I feel kind of bad for Lazarus. He didn't ask for all his clergy
Right.
to want him dead, because but I mean, but the point is that just because you see a miracle, even if you're there, if there isn't some sort of receptivity, some sort of openness in your heart already, if you think of like the parable of the seeds, the miracles are like seeds, but you can throw all the seeds that you want into a heart, but if there isn't an internal readiness for that sort of thing, the miracle will neither it will either produce like very short-lived belief, like you said, or it might even like bring out hostility, right? So I think it's a fairly safe answer to this question, that God isn't, even if God did all of those amazing miracles, they wouldn't bring about any sort of lasting consequence in themselves. The much more important work that's going to bring about the kind of knowledge of God that he wants happens at a much deeper level.
And Sam, exactly at the point about the Gospels too, and it's also interesting to see that oftentimes when Jesus performed these miracles, it says that he withdrew from the crowd, or
Yes.
that he would, or without. I think in Luke it says that when news spread about him, like he took like some alone time to pray. So you wonder, aren't you here for these things, Jesus? Aren't you here to perform these miracles and to do like all these amazing signs? But once you do them, you disappear. Then it kind of makes us see that, okay, maybe his point is not in the miracle itself. It is not in this wondrous action that everybody's seeking. He is seeking something more, because right after he performs a miracle, the entire focus shifts off of him and it becomes about the act that he performed. And you see people like with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, the next day they show up on the other side of the sea, like, okay, what are you going to show us today?
Yeah, that's right. That's
and
exactly
the Samaritan woman says, okay, he says, I have living water. She's like, okay, what about this water? Like what I need to drink? Like, so he is basically saying, I want to give you something more, but you're still like not seeing it for what it is. It's almost like having a rich father. And every time you ask him, you just ask him for cash. And then that person, no matter how amazing he is in other things, he becomes just a cash machine to you. And the day that he says, sorry, I want to give you something else, in your mind, he no longer becomes rich. He's no longer rich. Like you attribute what you want to believe about him through how you want to see him, not he wants to be presented to you. So it is not a public thing. So an individual thing then perhaps. So if God is not going to show himself publicly to all of us in like an apparition or miracles, or even though these things do happen, then he might choose to do it individually then. Chris.
But I guess the question is, right, like I'm going to play a little bit of be the controversial one in this conversation, right? We hear people always use faith as a means of division, meaning like you see so many wars that started from maybe an inappropriate use of faith, or maybe a means of trying to control humans, or push a certain agenda and say that it's backed by faith, and people will constantly say and blame God for the wars in the world, the conflict. So do you think, if we, maybe it's not about the public apparition because people wouldn't necessarily believe so much in him in relationally, but don't you think it would have an impact on sort of the conflict that's in the world? Because I think that's a question that a lot of people ask. So what do you guys think about that?
Same. I'll leave hard questions to you because Chris is always controversial.
Always.
Yeah, no, it is a good question, Chris. I think so. I mean, obviously, I think in some sense it would have an impact, right? If miracles started happening like predictably and repeatedly, or landmarks are traveling from continent to continent, with signed Jesus, or the God of the Christians, or something like that. That would impact history, and it would change the way people behaved. But I mean, if we're thinking about like, would that solve the problem of like religious conflict, for example? I really don't think so, only because, like, if you think of most of the wars that you learned about in high school, most of those were fought between Christians anyway, right? They had a disagreement in their interpretation of Christianity, or, the war was about something else, really, but it didn't really matter that they were both sides were Christian. And in fact, I think there's a sense in which, in a way, a sort of like certainty about the correctness of your religion in that way, without the internal transformation that we were talking about, could actually make people worse, right? There's nothing more frightening or more dangerous than someone who is doing evil in the conviction that what they're doing is God's will. And we can think of many examples that, not just from other religions, but within Christianity too.
Absolutely.
And so I think that, I mean, that's why, to sort of take it back to the Old Testament, one of the verses I think is really relevant, keeps popping up in my head, is where God complains in Isaiah that the people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So God could bring about a situation where everybody honors him with their lips, right? Everyone acknowledges the God of the Christians, and so there's no more fight about which of the religions is true. But if people's heart is still far from him, it's like we were saying, there's this connection between the problem of sin and the problem of knowledge of God. So long as people's hearts are far from him, I think that would just embolden. It would provide people more opportunity to be aggressive and to hate each other. So I think, it's I don't know. What do you think, Mina?
Did we lose him? I think Mina froze for a second.
Oh, that wasn't me.
No, that was Mina froze for a second.
Hasn't been. Yeah.
I'm here. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. He said, "What do you think,
Sorry.
Mina?"
Yeah, I agree, Sam. Absolutely. I think the issue here, would wars stop? I mean, maybe temporarily you would have a ceasefire, but it wouldn't prolong. And the reason really is simple. It's because large mass apparitions or God's existence is not personal. There's nothing personal about it. It's just like, it's abstract and it's far. And that might be good for me to like have a little bit of fear, but it will never be good enough for me to have and perform things out of love. And we know from the history of humanity is that things that are not performed out of love are never really great things. Every great
true.
act that has saved humanity has always been born of love. So God appearing, there's nothing personal about it. So it takes us back.
100%.
Yeah. So it takes us back to the individual issue then. So it means that God, away from publicly, God needs to make himself apparent and obvious individually. And how would God do that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Mina, because I think both of you are making it very clear that just for our listeners, a public apparition of God wouldn't change the heart and how we treat each other. How many of us have encountered or have a relationship with God and still at times have major conflict with one another? So I don't think we can tie faith necessarily to wars. I think wars are a human problem, or a pride problem, or an issue of us being unable to come to a common resolution about something, about not necessarily seeing eye to eye, but being able to walk hand in hand. I know that's like a slogan these days, but you see that households divided about politics. You see, families divided about faith. You see all these different things. It doesn't necessarily, like politics right now, specifically for us in the States, Sam, is a perfect example of how people have replaced religion now with politics. So politics is now your new, what tribe do you belong to, or what faith system do you belong to, so we can fight about it. So we've removed God from this whole conversation, and now it's about politics. And it's really a fascinating thing, because I think if God did appear in the present, situation of the world, people would be like, am I having a hallucination? Like, people would doubt themselves, people would doubt each other, because like you both have articulated so crystal clearly, it's a heart thing. If God doesn't resonate in the heart of man, behavior doesn't change, because God is not about behavior modification. He's about changing the heart and relationship. And from the relationship, things manifest out of love, like Nina was saying. So I think you both articulated the public problem about God's hiddenness from the world so crystal clearly.
And then also, Chris, it has, like, we can't deny that it has happened. There have been apparitions and sightings of things, and people have seen it. And actually, I mean, some people can kind of doubt if that actually happened, but to those who witnessed it, they believed it was real. So even if it wasn't real, it was real to them. And you still see that their behavior was not, it's not like they woke up the next day and they became like completely sinless human beings. It does not bear that effect because it's not the desired effect. These apparitions and these things that are taken by faith, again, God does not seek knowledge, because that's what Satan was trying to get, when he was tempting Jesus. He was trying to gain knowledge. Can this man perform these acts? And if he could, then I have knowledge that this man is powerful enough, I should heed him. But that is not, and that's how the Pharisees kind of dealt with him. Is he going to stir up trouble or not? But that's not what he wants us to do. He wants us to really start a relationship. And individually then, how is he going to reveal himself? Is he going to speak? Is he going to choose to like speak in the minds of each of us and just like ingrain us to know that God exists? But that wouldn't be fair, because that kind of takes away free will. Every time we watch a movie that there's a genie in the bottle and is always asked, and always ask the guy that finds it, you've got 3 wishes. There's always one, and maybe it's the first, maybe it's the third, depending on how romantic the guy is. He'd say, make her love me, make the girl love me. And genie always says, that's the one thing I cannot do. There's always, in every movie, it's just like that, because it will infringe on her free will. And God is the same way. God is not going to say, I'm going to make myself wired in your brain in a way that is undeniable so you don't have to choose me. Okay, then how is he going to appear to us individually then? Is he going to appear to each and every one of us who has ever lived on this planet from day one until today? And if he's going to do that, at what age is he going to do it? At what state of mind, or what frame of mind? It would probably make sense that he would do it once and would do it for everybody, and then everyone would believe, right? So yeah, I think that would kind of allow God to cross into our time and space and would become one of us.
What do you think about that, Sam? About the specifics of the personal, like Nina's expressing, like how would God reveal himself personally to us?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, yeah, if we're sort of considering it on a more like personal level, because in a way it's the same problem. It's like, we, or even non-believers. Although I think it's especially pressing for believers, because it's like, all right, so the free will thing is one thing, right? But like Mina was saying, God doesn't want to force people to believe in him. He wants it to be a natural thing. But it's particularly sort of like, and this bothers me as a Christian too. But like, if you're someone who already believes in God, you're on board with Christ. But when you're going through hard times or you're struggling with doubt, like would it kill God to, like little miracle, make a little, flower appear on your desk or something to, just kind of pick you up, make you realize that he's there. Yeah, so I mean, so I should have said earlier, but like my general, like I said, I think this isn't a question where there's a dogmatic, like clear answer in the tradition. But the reason I still think there's stuff to talk about is because I'm particularly interested in like how the Desert Fathers and the spiritual, like ascetic tradition in the church, like what that can bring to this question. And in that literature, there is a lot of talk. I was reading especially like St. Isaac the Syrian in sort of like to brush up on this. And he's got a really strong idea about, like, he's like, when you're going to go into any sort of spiritual struggle, you have to expect that there are going to be times of abandonment. You're going to feel, and it's intentional, you're going to feel as though God is not there. And, he says you've got to expect it as a constant sort of fluctuation. And he's really also very clear that it's not a simple matter of, well, God wants to teach you a lesson at this point in your life, so he's going to withdraw himself. He sort of says sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's it's a demonic thing. Sometimes it's something in you. But in any case, he wants the monks who are reading his letters to expect that they're going to experience times of like a sense of disconnection from God, and that even though that happens with God's permission, it's a complicated process where there's like so. Yeah, sorry, I got a bit lost in my train of thought there, but I think the one point that I wanted to make before we actually get into that personal problem more deeply is that, like I was saying before, um, this is something where it's very easy to oversimplify and think of it just as, well, there's God and there's me, and I want God to reveal himself more clearly to me. Whereas the reality is that it's a much more complicated picture, right? There's a whole network of free will, because my free will impacts your free will and so on. So there's a whole, and then there are angels and demons, and so in the ascetic tradition, they caution against thinking too narrowly about, well, God is trying to hide himself from me right now in order to teach me a lesson. That's what you can take out of it. That's what you should do whenever, it doesn't matter what the cause is for your sense of God's absence. Maybe there are reasons that God has, that he's doing it intentionally. Maybe there are other forces at work which God is allowing to work on you in order to test you. I don't know, but I mean, it's safer not to speculate about those particulars. But that's a very different thing to saying, all right, well, I'm in this situation and I trust God for other reasons, despite his apparent absence now. So how can I use this this experience in order to grow closer to God despite his absence?
Mm.
Though I think that kind of jumps ahead. I mean, I suppose the question there was really like, how is God going to like show himself, rather than like, what do we do when?
Well, I think, Sam, you moved us forward, but I think that's an important transition for us, because I'm thinking about when people question the existence of God, and when people question God's hiddenness, is usually during moments of suffering, usually during moments of like when they're going through a hard time or a trial or a difficulty. God, where are you? If you're real, how come you're not, in with me in this present moment during a global pandemic? How come you're not doing this? And we touched about this on a prior episode, but like, I think that's where a lot of the conflict comes from. When I am experiencing something and I don't feel like God is walking with me or present in this problem, I assume his absence. And if he is absent, is it because I've done something wrong? Is it because he's angry? And is it because he is wanting to refrain to kind of chastise me a little bit or discipline me? And then some people also extrapolate and come up with like other explanations, that this is like, God's anger towards me. So there's like so many, it's so multifaceted, but I think it all stems from the idea of like pain and suffering, right? Like
Yeah, and I think it's really, it can often be really like damaging to like read a reason into it, and to sort of, that's why I'm always emphasizing that like we've got to admit when we don't know something. And so, we can't sort of make answers up, because it is very easy. It's very tempting to say, oh, well, God is hiding himself from you, Chris, right now in this time.
Yeah.
You needed to look, you had this sin, and this is going to teach you a lesson. But I really enjoyed the fact that in the ascetic, the masters of this kind of thing, Saint Isaac the Syrian, and there's similar stuff in like the sayings of Saint Anthony. They're very clear about not reading motives into it. They say, God has obviously allowed this by his providence. Doesn't mean that it's a direct, he allows lots of things to happen that aren't directly his intention. If God had his way completely, no one would ever sin, no one would ever do anything contrary to his will. So it's a very complex story. And in that sense, right, the question of why it's happening is sort of put to the side, and the question of, can we still find, like, how are we actually practically going to get through these moments of suffering, that comes to the fore, right? I think there's something really inspiring about that, about sort of, we can't change the situation, and there's a question mark, and like there's a legitimate, I think it's kind of okay to have a Job-like moment of like, God, you'd better have a good explanation for this sort of, like I'm going with you, I'm with you, but I like the very sort of frank, like face-to-face conversation that Job has with God. And David does it too. There's all those Psalms where he's just sort of complaining to God, where are you? Where's all the amazing stuff you used to do for me? That sort of thing. So I think it's legitimate to have a sort of like an honest frustration. But in terms of like practically what you do, so we now have to say, all right, well, I'm in this situation. I've got to trust, based on what I know about God, that even though I don't know why this is happening, there are reasons that I, because of my relationship with, as we often give people the benefit of the doubt when we know them well, we can trust God on that basis. And in the meantime, the sense of abandonment, all of these fathers that I've been talking about, they also talk about these times of, these dark nights of the soul, to use a Western term, are really powerful sources of spiritual strength. Right? They're really like what you do in those moments becomes like the defining like characteristic of your spiritual struggle.
Yeah. I like to liken this to any other relationship, where suffering in any relationship brings people together. You know, um, you know, I think in thinking about my own marriage and thinking about, my relationship with my wife, we, like, in the first year of marriage, we had a friend who got killed by getting struck by a car. We had my uncle passed away young. We had like all this like crazy stuff that was happening all around us. And then like just like different transitions of things that were happening with us. And that difficulty brought us together. Now, I'm not going to compare my suffering to what another person experienced, but I do believe that anything you suffer for or you fight for ends up producing a lot of virtue and ends up producing a lot of strength. You think about somebody who trains for a marathon, and when they train for the marathon, they endure a lot of pain and suffering. But the end result for them, to take it to a very simplified version, is really amazing when they cross that finish line. And I think that we often discount suffering as it being a bad thing. And I think Mike Wingert touched on that last week very well, that he said in the West, we have this idea that suffering is bad. In the East, we have this idea that suffering is noble, it's honorable, it's something that produces strength and, builds up people. So I question and I wonder, like, just with what you've brought up, like the absence of God is trying, potentially, obviously I'm pulling out a theodicy, making an excuse for God, but, he's potentially trying to build strength within us, and produce something within us that will make us grasp for him more and draw nearer to him. But I think it depends on us, what we choose to be, either the victim or the victor, right? Like you could choose to be the victim and say, God, you're so mean, you've done all these bad things to me, or the circumstances, my life is so terrible. Or you can say, you know what, this experience is tough. I'm going to choose joy in the midst of it. I'm going to choose to use it as a means of strength. And I thank God for it, even though it really stinks. Like Job said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. But I think that's a really challenging thing because it depends on the person again. And I think that's where we keep coming back to, right? Like if
ahead, Chris, and to that point also, it's we have to, just like we do with relationships in general, people often says, do not make any decisions when you are in an emotional state. Don't like change your job once you've come home from a mission trip, or if you're upset with someone, don't blurt out like what's already on your mind, because usually when we are in an emotional state, a heightened emotional state, our decision-making ability and our deduction process of thinking is impaired. Put that on one end. On the other end, God's existence is binary. He either exists or he does not exist. He doesn't exist sometimes and not exist other times. So if you believe that he exists, then he always exists. But when you are in an emotional state, if you're suffering, you're going through trouble, your decision-making ability and the synthesis of information is not readily available to you, and it's automatic to assume things about God that are not true. Because when things were going well for you, you said, God is so good, and you believe that he existed, then philosophically, again, I'm not dismissing pain and suffering, I'm just speaking about it from a philosophical point of view. Even in the midst of suffering, the same God that you said, God is so good when things were going well, is the same man in the sky that was at the time when you're suffering as well. So when we're going through rough times, do not use these situations, as bad as they are, as difficult as they are, to make a point about God's existence, because you are not, you're not in a place where you can kind of see things clearly, and you need others to help you see that. And it takes us to that question of, so why would we want to see God then? I mean, God wants to see us, or wants to reveal himself to us so that we can have a relationship with him. and not just so that we have knowledge of his existence. We've already established that it's about a relationship. So for us, then, when we say I want a relationship, what is that about? Why do I want to seek a relationship with God? Is it because I want to believe he's real? Is it that I want to believe he's in control? Is it because I want to receive blessings? I want to know that he's got my back. We sometimes, when we don't define why do I want to know that God exists, we tend to keep running in circles. We run after signs. We just want to see miracles. We want to see amazing things happen. And we're not having an easy time defining that. So I think it is important for us to be able to define why we want to see God as well.
And Jesus says that. He said, these people seek me for the signs.
Mm.
So it's not something new. What do you think about what Mina was saying, Sam?
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I think it goes back to the theme that's come out from everything we've all been saying, I think, which is that the only thing that really is going to help us, the only reason that we should really ultimately want to know God is in order for him to transform us from within. Because everything else is just a band-aid solution, right? All the pain and the longing and the suffering that we go through, the root of all that is I'm talking from a believer's perspective now, not the public problem, but the root of all that is our disconnection from God. And the way that you get reconnected to God is through relationship. It's not through seeing some display of power. And so, what Mina was saying actually reminded me of there's a strange saying in the Desert Fathers where this monk is praying, and this shining being figure appears in his room and says, "Behold, I'm Christ, I've come to you." And the monk closes his eyes and he says, "I do not want to see Christ in this life, I want to see him in the next." So he refuses. It's a very common theme actually in lots of ascetic writing. If you ever see an external sign of Christ, close your eyes. You don't want anything to do with that, right? Same thing as the story of Saint Bashoy. The Christ is going to appear on the mountain, so everyone's rushing. But Saint Bashoy is okay, Christ is on the mountain, but there's this old guy here who I'm going to stop and help, because seeing Christ outside in the way that we often feel like we want to is not ultimately the most important thing. And we should actually, as mature Christians, we're being encouraged to train ourselves to not look for Christ in that way, to look for him in terms of actual, having his characteristics, having his presence internally, and not being distracted by the outward signs. That said, I would love a couple of outward signs, don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
Wants to appear every now and then and just everything's going okay. I'm not gonna complain.
And he does. And then I guess many of us, we forget easily. If we were to keep a record of how God has worked in our lives, I think a lot of us would be reminded of that more readily. And to the point that you were saying earlier about this is how, when we are continuously seeking a relationship with God, to see him in that light. Because when we're trying to see him for different reasons, this is when you start seeing emails that come forward, this is a picture of St. Mary forwarded to 100 people to receive blessings this week. That's the type of stuff that you that makes you feel guilty, because you are just constantly seeking signs, because you are looking for things to change in your life. You're again, that goes to the main issue of God saying, we can do these things. I want to show you something that is a lot more personal. And also, something that we very easily dismiss is that when we are constantly seeking acts of supernatural signs, then we are dismissing the natural as miraculous. And the natural itself is so miraculous and so profound that we got so used to it, and we're diluted by it because it's everywhere, that we dismiss that so easily as nothing amazing about it. Chris, remember the book you're reading about the trees? And
I was just gonna literally, you gave me a perfect segue into that. I was reading about the secret language of trees. Have you heard about this, Sam? How trees communicate to one another through their fungal network? So
no.
It's really fascinating, right? So this is how I believe that God has planted himself in everywhere. So trees, when there is like a parasite nearby or attacks one tree, they send signals to the neighboring trees to communicate that there is like a parasite nearby. If you Google this, it's fascinating. I'm obviously, minimizing how amazing it is. But yeah, totally. Like when we think about like the sun and the moon and the stars and the beauty of nature around us, the natural, God is definitely communicating to the world. And this beauty of like community in trees, like when you go on a hike next time, thinking about how these trees need one another and how God has even put it in the trees around us to teach us how we need each other, that if the trees need each other, we definitely need each other. And I think COVID has given us a glimpse of this, this need for one another and this need for community more than ever. So yeah, I definitely agree with you, Mina, in terms of like God not being hidden, actually being very apparent in nature and in the world around us and in each other. I mean, how many of us have experienced God through one another? So one of us talking to each other, sharing something through each other, an act of love or compassion.
And I remember when you told me about that, when I was reading up on it, like one example also that stuck out to me is that it said that trees that are short and in the forest and cannot, because they're surrounded by like larger trees and they don't get as much sunlight for their photosynthesis. The other trees send nutrients to the fungal network to that one tree so it can be nourished. It's unbelievable. And you take that and like multiply it by every like science and study and discipline. There's so many stories across that kind of reveal that. And it does show that God's most amazing manifestation is to work through people. He has chosen to reveal himself through people. And that's really like the one answer that like you would want to consider and take home with you at the end of the day. This is how we're made to see God, through each other and through supporting each other.
So I guess that brings us to that question. So how do we train our eyes to see God more clearly? Sam, what do you think about that? Like for those who maybe miss the nature and miss, the signs and the way God is communicating around us, how do we train our eyes?
Yeah, so I feel that's a question for someone, like I feel very unqualified to answer that question, because if I could do it, I would, I would have done it better myself. But I don't know.
So what do you do personally for yourself? Like, what do you do, that to put you on the spot, Sam? I like to put people on the spot. Sorry, man.
I might return the favor later, but
go.
I think that, look, I don't know. I mean, I think it ties back into what we were saying before, but the only like reliable, like the times when I could say I've felt God's presence most clearly have been times of suffering, right? Like where there's been nothing else to fall back on. But it was very important to me. Like I was thinking, I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to emphasize that, like, I find it very hard and I think unnecessary to think of when bad things happen, well, God is doing this to me at the moment in order to bring about some result. And I mean, I think that's it's not necessary, and it's probably best not to make that judgment, because we don't know everything that God is doing or the reasons that He's doing it. And also because, like, especially in the ascetic tradition and just like generally in Orthodox tradition, we're only talking about this problem of divine hiddenness because of the fall, right? The fall is what damages our spiritual eyes so that we can't see God. So it was important to me in those times, and it still is, to not think of it as God is testing me. God is, maybe that's why He's allowing it, but I don't think of it as God doing something to me. Instead, it's just it's a matter of the world is the way it is, and there are forces working against God, and they're probably at work here, and they're the ones trying to say to me, God doesn't care about you. God doesn't, where is He? He would show up if He really, or fix this problem if He really loved you. But then those are the times where, in those moments of absence, you're most able to relate and participate with Christ, right? It's that thing that you said about choosing not to be a victim of the circumstance, and actually, like Christ, who could have, He could have like killed His persecutors and just sort of broken out at any point, but He willingly took upon Himself the suffering of the cross, and he bore the insults of the people, and He even cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" And He did all of that willingly as an expression of love, right? And so for us, it's different in that we don't have the power to like stop all of our problems instantly like Jesus did. But we can still, like while we're in them, take them on willingly and say, you know, I don't know why this is happening exactly, but I'm going to be as faithful to God as Christ was to the best of my ability. Or if I can't do that, I'm going to ask at least for the strength to do that. And I think that's the time when God will really show up the clearest. You know? That's the big message I take away from the ascetic writings, is that like St. Isaac and a few others, they all have these phrases at the end. They're like, when these periods come upon you where you're suffering and you can't sense God, you have to persist as though you weren't expecting, you have to expect help, but expect it in its own time. But you have to expect that God is going to fix the problem. And then it will come when you're not particularly like expecting it's going to come all of a sudden, when you're no longer sort of like desperately waiting for it, when you're content to just go through and endure patiently and humbly. Easier said than done, but I mean, I think that's the, you know, in terms of what we can actually do, we're going to suffer. And this is the, you know, that's the time when you're suffering to try and open your eyes and your heart to God, because that's when he'll really, you know, when he acts in that case, it's really going to be something spectacular.
Because suffering doesn't discriminate.
No, exactly. That's right.
You go to hospitals, you go you know, it doesn't matter, you know, gender, race, religion. There is no, suffering doesn't, you know, choose. It happens to all of us, and all of us at some point or another will suffer. And I can recall vivid moments of my life, Sam, funny that you say that, where I would say, you know, God, if you take me out of this experience or this moment, I will be this and I will do this and I will blah, blah, blah. And then you quickly forget the things that you say when you pass through the circumstances. But now in hindsight, you look back and you're like, wow, God, you got me through that. Time and time again, all the things that I had, you know, swore that I would do and vowed that I would do, I didn't do. So I fell short. So it's like a really funny, you know, irony that we say, God, make yourself clear, do this, help me through the circumstance. And then he does in the timing that he sees will be most beneficial. But then we forget so quickly how fickle we are as humans of where and what God is doing in the midst of our lives.
In the timing and in the form that he's choosing as well. Sometimes we're just so stuck in the way we want to see things, and we forget that. I think A.W. Tozer says God waits to be wanted. Like, and it sounds strange to us humans to see that, but you know what? Like, yeah, he's saying this is mutual, buddy. Like me and you, maybe it's causing him suffering. You know, for how we're all like continually turning a blind eye. His entire thing is for us to know him, not to be in knowledge of his existence, but to know him and to know him through people. He has given us each other to see that. We can choose to either see him through everything or not see him through anything. When I was younger, I used to laugh when people used to say, you know, oh, the weather is so beautiful today. I prayed so that it doesn't rain because I have like my son's soccer game and it's not raining. God is so great. I used to laugh at these things, but like, lady, like God is not like, so
and they bring an umbrella. They bring an umbrella to the soccer game. So you prayed, and then you had an umbrella with you. So you didn't believe that your prayer would actually be answered. Right. You know, so.
But honestly, it speaks to something a lot. It speaks to something much, much deeper. Is that people who can actually do that on a deep level choose to believe that God's revelation and existence and His hand touches everything that you do. And it is relational. It's not just a way. Yes, he might have not stopped the rain today, particularly for your son's soccer game, but he does still care, and he's listening, and he's there with you, walking with you. So it's something for us to really consider as we talk about faith. God is not playing a trick on you. God is not trying to trick you and say, just have blind faith. He's saying, look at the evidence. See the evidence through people who are alive today, and make an educated and heartfelt and experienced decision that is away from emotions, and see how God really works in your life and the lives of others around you.
That's a good point.
Seek the Lord and he is found. Like if you seek him, you know, I think he is not trying to hide himself from people. And I think that's the beautiful thing is, you know, Sam, you said something that really resonated with me about the absence of God. And I think, you know, don't assume, you know, because when you make assumptions about God's intentions, it really gets you nowhere. And I think that's there is a wisdom in the Desert Fathers saying that, like you said, because I think when you start to give reason for God, it gets a lot of people in trouble. It teaches a lot of strange theology. It teaches a lot of very interesting things that's often very harmful to people. So I think for our listeners, Sam gave us a golden nugget there about, just don't make assumptions about God's intention for whatever circumstances you're going through where you feel God's absence.
And expect
Can I just
help.
touch on?
Yeah, go Sam.
Also, I wanted to touch on something Mina said there. You reminded me of it, because I think it is important that there is a foundation, like the thing that's going to get us through these periods where we feel disconnected from God is, like Mina was saying, a sort of a conviction of who God is that is independent of those experiences, like a sort of like a more like, not necessarily like just a rational decision, but sort of like when you've looked at the evidence and you've become convinced of who God is, then that's what you bring to these situations and that's what you hold on to. So I think, that could be for people like, for me, it started as a sort of like, teenager. I was reading all sorts of apologetics things because I wanted to know about, evidence for the resurrection and that sort of thing. And that can be a good starting point. But I think the reason I bring it up now is because the most important thing about not attributing motives to God is that I think that we get into trouble when we use some lens for understanding who God is that is distinct from the cross. Because the cross is like the ultimate, we're talking about God revealing himself. Like the moment that God really shows who he is in Christ is when he's on the cross, right? He's pouring himself out. He's emptying himself for us. And that's the ultimate expression of who God is. And so when we sort of think of God as like, we attribute to him motives that aren't commensurate with that, like he's sort of, he's punishing us for, some petty reason, or we think that, the point that I'm making is right, that like the thing that should be our conviction that gets us through these moments is that if you believe that the God who exists is the God who died for us on the cross and poured himself out in that way and forgave and loved even those who were like murdering him, that's the God who is now, for whatever reason, being silent. But you got to remember that that's the one who's behind the veil at the moment, right? It's not anyone else. It's that same God who was on the cross. And so long as we have conviction in that, we can take comfort in the fact that, in a way, we're kind of sharing in the same experience, right? That's part of our taking up of our cross. We're not doing it sinlessly like Christ, but he's given us the opportunity to use our suffering to kind of partake in the, like Paul says, like fill up in our flesh the sufferings of Christ. But it's important to be convicted of, even though it's not visible to us right now, the God that we're looking for behind the darkness is the same one that died in love for us on the cross.
I think that's a necessary point for those who are Christians to look at, is that, and even for those who aren't Christians, to see that the God in Christ came and took flesh, dwelt among us, and suffered with us, and suffered on our behalf, and encountered all the things that we encounter. He's not a God who's distant. He's a God who's present. So when we experience these things that we struggle with and we can't understand, and we're like, why are all these difficult circumstances happening? He encountered them too. And I think that brings such like a sense of peace, is when I'm like going through a period of like loneliness, or a period of like, I feel like people are saying things about me that are fallacies. I think that of Christ who encountered these exact experiences. And I think that gives a lot of peace, that it's not like, again, he's not a God who's distant. He's a God who is with us, Emmanuel, God with us.
So true. I can't resist sharing, because this is like my favorite thing ever. I want everyone to know about it. I remember Father Tom Hopko of blessed memory making the point that so in Genesis 2 talks about how a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And so apparently that verb, like leave, man shall leave or forsake his father and mother, in Hebrew that only occurs twice in the whole Old Testament. So one is there in Genesis 2, but the other one is in Psalm 22, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me? So Father Tom liked to make the point that that's the moment of like when God is when Christ is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the moment at which he is like the man in Genesis 2 who leaves his father and mother, or is forsaken by his father and mother, to be joined to his wife. So the cross is the moment where he's fully identified with that experience. He's the Son of God, so he's never separated from the Father. But the point is that he's speaking now on behalf of all human beings, right? He's now fully appropriated into himself the experience of that loneliness and that being cut off. And now he's one flesh with human beings, right? If we're abandoned, he's abandoned. But the point obviously is that because he's the Son of God, he can't be abandoned. Now that he's joined himself to us through that painful experience, we can share with, even if it doesn't feel like it, when we're feeling that sense of disconnection from God, we're in the same place that Christ was, and he can carry us up through it.
That's beautiful.
So it's the most
beautiful,
nerdy but amazing point that Father Tom ever made. I think
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So just for the sake of time, guys, because we want to make sure we touched on a lot of things. Let's give closing thoughts. Like, if we want to address this question once and for all, is God playing hard to get? Is he hiding himself from people? What do you want people to walk away with? Mina Sawiris, you jump in and you chime in and tell us your thoughts, and then Sam, I'll let you close us out.
I would say that God has chosen to reveal himself in order for us to know him personally, not to know of his existence. I think to take this back to the point of how would God choose to reveal himself, we would say that he would appear once and appear across the time and space and come and dwell among us. How would he come? Would he come as Batman? Would he come as a king? Maybe would he come as the president of the United States? Probably not. But he would choose not to. He's going to come as a humble man to be relatable to all of us. Then if he comes as a humble man, how will we know him? Then he might maybe choose to pre-announce his coming. He will tell people across the ages that I am coming, and look out for signs because I'll be there. And another 100 years, he'll tell somebody else, maybe I'm coming. And maybe that's how God would choose to reveal himself to us. And that's starting to sound really familiar to a story that we know about the man Jesus and the God Jesus. So, considering everything that we said, God is not going to draw back a curtain, reveal himself. Cosmic wonders don't mean much. He's going to make himself personal, pre-announce, and he's going to come in his glory, breaking the time and space barrier to dwell among us so that we would get to know him. And then even if that happened 2,000 years ago, he is not bound by time and space. He can choose to reveal himself through us in miraculous ways, in personal ways, through relationships, through nature, in every possible way, as long as we choose to see him in everything around us and not dismiss him when times are difficult.
Wow. Sam.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's not,
Did you take a breath, Mina? You didn't even take a breath. Dang, that was
one shot.
You were like going, man. Take a sip of water. Woo. I saw fire come out, man. That was like,
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. I don't know. I mean, I'd sort of sum up in like to distill all of that. I mean, I think I agree. It's not that he's playing hard to get. He's just he's not showing up in the way that we expect him to, or that we want him to, only because we're not necessarily by default looking for him as he is. We're looking for something else, and so that's why he seems to be playing hard to get. He's kind of, what he wants from us is to actually sort of attune our eyes, the eyes of our hearts, to reality and to who he actually is, so that when we see him, we're seeing the real him and not just a sort of a shiny idol that we've made up for ourselves. So yeah, he wants to know us, or he wants us to know him, but it's got to be the real him.
Yeah. I always am reminded of the story of the golden calf. Right. And you think about the Israelites, right? The Israelites, they had God had literally parted the Red Sea. He had, fed them through a variety of different means. He had done miracles, sign and wonder plagues. And then when he was absent for a period, what did they do? They constructed this golden calf with their own gold. Like they made these, like they took jewelry off their own neck and formed this golden calf and began to worship it. And that always boggles my mind. It always makes me crazy. I'm like, how could you see what you saw and still do what you did? But isn't that what we all do every single day? We form a God in our own image and likeness in terms of what we want him to be. We want him to look. And I always say, why did they do that? But the reason why they did that is because they didn't want to actually hear God's voice. They wanted to hear their own. And I think that's the crux of the hiddenness of God, is that God sometimes is speaking so loud and clearly to us, but we are so deaf to his voice because our voice is so much louder. So I would encourage our listeners to, if you missed part of this Facebook Live, listen to the podcast when it comes out audio, because Sam and Mina both gave us some really incredible things. But before we wrap up, Dr. Samuel Kaldas, please tell us about some of the amazing initiatives. Guys, just for those who have not, who don't know or aren't familiar with what Sam has done, if you guys have read the book, O So Great a Salvation, The Life of Bishop Epiphanius, that was translated by Sam and I believe a group with you, correct, Sam? Or was that your project?
Me and my teta.
You and your teta.
No.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, this is, so if you've read that book, that's big, but there's other translation efforts that Sam is doing. So Sam, give us tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. So, I mean, I wanted to quickly, so I work at St. Cyril's College in Sydney, and one of the things, so it's not just me, I've been working on it with a few people, but we noticed that there's this, if you go to the Arabic section of your church bookshop, there's this huge mountain of stuff, and if you don't read Arabic, it's just, completely inaccessible to you. So one of the things that we've been working on recently is a website which makes translations of valuable texts of like Coptic theology from the last 2 centuries or so. So I mean, it's an academic website, but it's all completely so it's got like citation information. It's kind of designed for theology students and researchers, but it's also, I mean, you can use it pastorally because the texts are all just there. And the reason I wanted to mention it is because what we really need, in order, there's a huge backlog of very valuable material that people would benefit from reading in English. But we really need volunteer translators. So if you have people around you like my teta, who read Arabic and they have good Arabic and good English, and they're willing to sort of work through some really interesting texts and translate them. I'd be really appreciate if they got in touch with me. And the other thing is that if you're a theology student, at a Coptic college or elsewhere, so like, for example, like Chris was, when we first started talking, Chris is working on some stuff to do with the church calendar. And he was like, well, there's nothing about the Coptic church, the readings in the church calendar. And there's no, you can find lots of English stuff about the Eastern Orthodox lectionary, but nothing about the Coptic one. And there's a bunch written in Arabic. And so what we did was we found a guy. I hope he got in touch with you, by the way. Yep. Yeah. So we found a guy and asked him, can we translate this and put it on the website? So now that's up there for the next student who wants to write about the church readings in the Coptic church. So if you're pursuing any like topic in Coptic theology and you want a perspective on it that it's in texts that aren't translated, that's really what this is there for, right? So get in touch with us, and we can try and work something out. So the website is acot.stcyrils.edu.au. But I'll send you the link. You can.
We'll put it also in the podcast notes, and we'll put it in the description for sure. I definitely benefit personally from this effort, because Sam, like you said, you translated that book for me, which was super valuable. That chapter. I'm hoping that I get the rest of it at some point, from Dr. Fouad Naguib.
You went. I lost audio for.
Can you hear us?
Yeah. Sorry. I lost like the last 30 seconds.
No, I was saying that.
Sorry, Chris.
Go ahead, Mina. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say maybe next time we can have your teta on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Tita in English is Arabic, is grandma, guys. Tita's Arabic for grandma.
So she's good value. Yeah.
Sam and his grandma translated a book about Bishop Epiphanius. Amazing. God bless your Tita, man. It benefited many.
Thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you, Sam, so much, so much. Guys, just a plug, if you are interested in theological education, St. Cyril's Coptic Orthodox Theological College in Sydney, Australia. Sam is a lecturer and a researcher there. He lectures in philosophy and theology, but they also have amazing programs there as well. We spoke about Agora last week, but St. Cyril's is also another another amazing resource if you are interested in theological education. So
and
thank
you
you
guys
again.
are very blessed. You have many very good theological Coptic theological colleges in America too. So don't, like, I mean, consider those too. It's especially good if you can go in person.
Just study and learn. That's the key.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again, Sam. We appreciate having you on, and we have a lot to think about with this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great to meet you guys.
Me too, man. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you check us out on Facebook, on iTunes. Find us where you find your podcasts. We've got 2 more episodes before the season ends. Send us an email or a message on Facebook. Tell us what you want us to discuss in the next theme for season 2. Really excited about getting that started.
We have a bunch of ideas, but we are trying to hone in on the direction that we're going next season.
And what you want. We want to hear about what you want, not what we want.
Exactly. Yeah.
Amen.
Thanks, me. Thanks. All right, guys.
Take care.
Awesome.